All right, well, hello, and thank you all for joining us on Facebook Live tonight for this artist talk. My name is Bradley Butler. I am the Executive Director and Curator at Main Street Arts in Clifton Springs, New York. And I am joined by four of the artists in Biblio Spectaculum, which is a national juried exhibition, including the work of 33 artists from 12 different states. Each Friday at 5 p.m. throughout the month of July, we will be hopping onto Facebook Live to talk with four different artists from the show. Gives people a great opportunity to see the work being done by artists from across the country, as far as artist books and text-based work. So tonight I am joined by Michael Darcy of Rochester, New York, Roni Gross of New York, New York, James Hannaham of Brooklyn, New York, and Holland Hopson of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight as well. So what we'll do is we will start by having each of these artists introduce themselves and tell us a bit about their work, their art practice, and then they will get a chance to talk more in depth about the work that's included in this exhibition. If anyone out there has questions, just please type them in the comments and we'll ask them as we go along. Also, fun comments or observations are also encouraged. Don't forget that you can see this exhibition for yourself, whether you're local or not. If you're local, or you can travel a short distance to us here in Clifton Springs, you can make an appointment on mainstreetartscs.org. We are open for appointments on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. While it's encouraged to see the show in person if you can, the next best thing is seeing the exhibition in our online interactive format. And you can basically see the exhibition as it's installed here in the gallery by scrolling through. And you can do this from the comfort of your own home, which is kind of nice. And what you can do there is click on any piece in the show, view more information about it. If there is a book in the show, you can actually click on it and then flip through by clicking, so you can see all the pages in the book, which is a really great feature. So that's it from me. So first up, we've got Michael Darcy. So Michael, would you like to give us a little bit of background about yourself or your art practice in general?
Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Michael Darcy. I'm an artist based in Rochester, New York. I'm currently an MFA student at the Visual Studies workshop here. I'm in my third year. It's a third-year program, so I'm about to start working on my thesis. I came to the program with a background in photography. I kind of started doing photography a little bit in high school. I ended up going to undergrad for photography, and it was a very commercial program, so a lot of lighting and technical studies. I ended up out doing an internship in Colorado at an art center, and then that kind of changed things for me. I kind of got bored with the commercial side of things and got a lot more interested in the fine art and just art. So then after a couple of years, I kept working with photography and still images. I did a project for a long time that I'm still kind of working on about Minor White, where I was going to different locations that he photographed, taking my own images, and kind of interpreting his life through my own photography. And then I ended up deciding to go to school, and when I got there, Visual Studies Workshop is a heavy influence in the book arts world, so I got really involved with that, and it kind of solved one of the problems I was having or starting to have with photography, where I was kind of just, I don't know, bored of still images, and just the introduction of time really made them a lot more exciting. So the juror Scott McCartney, his partner Keith Smith, has a book that I'm sure a lot of you know called Structure of the Visual Book, and that was like a huge deep dive for me over the last year, and so that really influenced a lot of the work I've been making lately. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, and we'll hear more from Michael in a little bit, and we will see some images of his work as well. Okay, let's see here. So, Roni, would you want to go next here?
Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay, I'm Roni Gross. I'm in New York City. Before I began working as a visual artist, I was a choreographer and a graphic designer. And it was kind of a short step between focusing on typography on a computer and going backwards in time to study typography through the practice of hand-setting metal type. And I began that study at the Center for Book Arts, where I have now taught for many years. I love the sculptural quality of letterpress printing, and I think the visceral aspect of it appealed to me in the same way that working with the body had. You know, as a dancer, I never felt that I would feel as passionate about anything else as I had about that. But somehow, when I made my first book, I really did feel as passionate, and there was something very wonderful about having something in the palm of my hand instead of something that was ephemeral. So I began doing projects, many of which were related to books, and it took me a few years before I could see that some of the ways that I had used to construct dances were actually influencing my book work, like accumulation, repetition, thinking about the arc of the action, and the strategic use of props and their integration into the whole. I am inspired by language, and that was also true as a choreographer. Much of my work has included poetry, mostly of contemporary poets. And there's something about the sparseness of the language that leaves a lot of room for the integration of sensory experience. All of my work have been printed editions, letterpress printed. I often work with my husband, who's a sculptor, because it allows is multi. So we aim to create an environment in which to experience a text through temperature, weight, and motion to invite the reader to deepen their understanding of the text. During this pandemic, I have been expanding into things that don't involve a press. A friend gave me a book in which he bound off cuts of his prints and a lot of blank pages. And so for about the first 6 weeks of the pandemic, I was doing drawings that I was embedding in collages that ended up focusing on the landscape of Australia and Aboriginal history. After I finished that book, I have been working on altered texts, you know, finding interior poems, incorporating photographs, colored pencil, and collage. And it's been a pretty interesting time, you know, not to be focused on the press. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that this this time has definitely, you know, had all of us artists shifting what we do, especially if we need to leave the house to go to a studio or to use equipment. So that's definitely a common thread, I think. So thank you, and we'll hear more from you as well when we get back around here. Okay, so James, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and your work?
Would I like to, or am I going to? That's really the question.
I hope you will.
Well, your question is so dauntingly vague. I almost feel like, yeah, and there's like so much I could, I mean, if I wanted to kind of try to summarize what I've done, I would say as an undergraduate, I studied graphic design. And then through a series of weird things, I became part of a performance group and a reviewer of performance and a writer. And I was I was working for the Village Voice as a design assistant. And then eventually, I'm going to skip a lot. And then eventually I got a job at Pratt after I had been, you know, gotten an MFA in writing and all of this stuff. And I realized that I could sort of go back to my roots as a designer at the same time as I was also still doing writing things, because I'd always been kind of like, one of the reasons I took a job at The Voice was that I had a problem as a graphic designer with making things pretty. I was already really kind of interested in conceptual artists. Like, I was a big fan of Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer, and, you know, people who were just working with text. And I'd always thought like, oh, I'd want to do that if I was going to try to, you know, be a designer. And so at a certain point, I started teaching this class that was about exactly all of those people. It was called Writing as Visual Art. And one of those things happened, you know, that happens to you when you teach, which is that sometimes you teach yourself something at the same time as you're teaching your students. You're like, oh, I could do this thing. So I started doing this thing. And it all related to, I was writing these kind of jokey versions of wall text, you know, the things you would find in museums next to a work of art, because that was actually something that I was really interested in, like people's relationship to that, because I had seen Glenn Ligon had this gigantic retrospective at the Whitney a bunch of years ago, and he has this piece called Notes on the Black Book, where he'd taken all of these Robert Mapplethorpe photographs that are rather, you know, erotic and exploitative of like Black men's bodies. And he had taken these photographs and showed them to like all sorts of people in all sorts of walks of life. And there were these little note cards with all of their quotes on them. And the room is pretty huge. And I walked into the room and I noticed that everybody was peering at these note cards, like trying to read exactly what was on them. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. It seems like people subscribe to literary journals to look at the pictures, and they go to art museums to read. So I thought I would try to exploit this relationship in some way by writing these didactics is the technical term for them, that were questionable in some way, or they put a frame around artwork that was a little specious and made you say like, well, maybe, but, you know, they were sort of tongue-in-cheek. Like the first one I ever did was a piece that was contextualizing the entire planet as a found object. And so that practice kind of developed. And then lately, one of the pieces that's in this show is a little bit different than that, because I'd gotten a vinyl cutter and I was like, you know, making all of these things that had to do with didactics, but were not specifically, I'd made like frames that looked like beveled edge didactics, but they were like 16 by 20. So there was kind of, they had taken the place actually of the work of art essentially, right? Like, so people are used to seeing like, here's a painting, but instead of the painting, you'd get the didactic for a painting that either didn't exist or there was some way in which it was referred to, but it was, you know, in your mind, like those Yoko Ono pieces from like forever ago. And I had been trying at a certain point, I was using this material called glow sand. And I had made some that you kind of couldn't read unless they were in the dark. And I started getting really interested in the idea that there would be this thing that only had a life like after the gallery was closed or something, like the lights would go off and you would be able to read this thing. And I tried really hard to find some way to put something on the surface that was, you know, not readable. And then in order to make the piece, one of the pieces that's in the show, I realized that these store-bought canvases can actually be used as light boxes, essentially. And so I printed on both sides a thing that it's hard to explain really, but maybe that's enough, and I'll say more about it when it can be seen. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no. And I like what you were talking about earlier about, you know, kind of that line between graphic design, and like being a graphic designer, being an artist, and kind of like, and then also a writer, and how all those things overlap. And, you know, a lot of the time people see such delineate, like a designer is not an artist, or an artist is not a designer, but some people kind of see it differently. So it's interesting to see how those worlds overlap for you.
Right, and one internalizes these things as well sometimes. So I was really glad and gratified to hear Roni talking about, choreography becoming, influencing the way that she's working now. It's reminding me of Yvonne Rainer.
Great, well, thank you, and we'll hear more from James shortly. So Holland, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and a little bit about your work?
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot for having us here. My name is Holland Hopson, and I'm a new media artist. Most of my work involves sound or music. And so the piece in the show in Biblio Spectaculum is a little bit of an outlier. I'm currently in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where I teach at the University of Alabama in New College and the Department of Art and Art History. New College is a department where the students, it's an interdisciplinary program where students design their own majors. And I'm a good fit there with the students who don't fit anywhere else because we all kind of fall in between the cracks. My training is in music, and I have an MFA in electronic arts from closer to Clifton Springs, from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. And so I have an art kind of degree, but do a lot of work that my colleagues in the art world don't always embrace as their own, and use language that my colleagues in the music worlds don't always embrace as their own too. And that's actually kind of a comfortable place for me in between those areas. The one thing that I would say that brings that work together, besides, well, a couple of things. One is I'm really interested in treating computer technology and computers kind of as partners in creating the work, not just as a really expensive paintbrush or lead type or gorgeous paper or instrument, but as something that can have some input in how the piece unfolds and direct that experience. And the other thing that is common with a lot of my work is that it's kind of, I make pieces that are sort of open systems. So there's not a single realization that is the definitive version of the piece. I might write a musical score that you don't read from top to bottom in a linear fashion, but that you can navigate your way through. And so every performance winds up being a little different. We'll see there's something similar going on with the piece that's in the show where we'll look at today. When I perform solo, I do a lot of solo music performance. So I work with traditional Appalachian banjo and live electronics, and there's a similar kind of aesthetic there where I'll define boundaries or sort of playground and then engage in that, and I'm not always sure which way the computer is going to take that conversation as the piece unfolds. So I'll skip over the stuff about texts and how much I love libraries and friends who are book artists, and leave it at that. So, but really happy to be part of this conversation and hear from everyone about their work.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think each week, I kind of talk about the connections that we see from everyone talking, and it's just interesting to hear the varied backgrounds that everyone has, and then how that comes across in the work. And I don't know if it's something that's indicative of this type of show or the type of work that people make that submit to a kind of show like this, that you kind of all come from all these very different backgrounds that kind of drive you into doing the work you do. But it's very interesting. So thank you. So now we're gonna get high tech. We're gonna share some images here, and we're gonna go back to Michael. And I'm going to pull your work up first. And so anyone who has a video on the piece, we have screenshots. So So we've got screenshots up. So I'll kind of just scroll through those, Michael, as you talk about this work. So you can go ahead.
Cool. So this is a book project that I worked on the last couple months. I'm still in the process of creating an edition of it, which several copies are bound and ready to go. It's a book called Present that is kind of a pun, I guess, that plays on the idea of like a present that is like a gift or being present. A lot of the artists I've heard on the past talks here, or even today, have mentioned that they are heavily influenced with text, which makes a lot of sense for the premise of the show. But text is kind of something that I haven't spent a lot of time working with. I definitely came to this more from this idea of structure, which I was talking about earlier. So the book is bound on two sides and has to be torn apart to be read. Which, like James was talking about, his work being difficult to see or to experience virtually, this book has been a real pain. It was something I was working on this semester right when COVID hit, and then having to like document it and try and have critique around it was just an experience in and of itself. But so the book it's bound on two edges. And all the pages are randomly shuffled. So it's going to be an edition of 25 and each one will be a unique experience. There's commands throughout the book, which because of interventions like random pages are glued together and some pages are sewn together with a sewing machine, some of the commands you can't really follow. So it kind of puts the reader in this place where they have to make decisions like if they're going to follow or how do they feel about it. So I don't know how successful it is, but one of my intentions with the book was to try to kind of create like this personal introspection as you go through. And it's like, am I okay breaking the rules? Do I just ignore the rules? Do I enjoy just the experience of tearing the pages and the colors? Or am I like, some people I've given the book to have really struggled with it because it's like they can't follow the directions. So yeah, one of the influences before I made this, when Ram Dass died, I really got into looking at his book Be Here Now, and so that became a big influence going into this, just kind of thinking about being present, and so that's where the title comes from. Yeah, so I don't know. I think that's pretty much about it. It's kind of one of those books where it's like I always feel weird talking about it just because it kind of ruins it for somebody who might read it now that's been like kind of like the joke's been told. So
well,
yeah.
Have you had anyone else interact with the book by reading it?
Yeah, so that's actually, I mean, I'm excited to get the edition done, just because one of the big hurdles as we had critique this semester was that I'd have to make a new one for every critique. And then for one critique, I made one for everybody. We have really small class sizes, so it wasn't too much work. But then the critique drifted into this realm of like talking about everyone's experience watching each other read the book, which was really interesting, but also kind of like in some ways not helpful for trying to understand how people's individual experience was. So it's kind of been an interesting process. And then when we had our final critique, which this video was actually made for in part for this show, people were like critiquing the video as a video piece, which it is, but so it's kind of, I don't know, it's interestingly enough, during this COVID virtual world become kind of like really, I don't know, it's like right in that kind of question area about art and reproduction. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, you know, in order to experience it, you have to destroy it.
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah, the video definitely I mean, in the context of the show, it comes off as a video piece because while we have the book can be seen in the show, it's in its red, state. So it's, it's essentially torn up pieces of paper inside of the box, that we saw in the first slide. And then, as people are walking in, they can hear the tearing and ripping of pages. And, some people, as they kind of approach it, they weren't sure if they were hearing like birds rustling or, they weren't sure what they were hearing. So it's interesting. And I've talked about this, I think last week or the week before. There are 3 different videos with sound in the show, and they kind of all combine into one interesting, strange soundtrack. So, so it definitely is interesting to have, sound as part of, a book piece. So, yeah. And also we have, we put the link so you can watch the full video of Michael reading this book in the comments on Facebook here. So great. Well, thank you very much. And I think we just got a couple more of your slides here. It doesn't give the whole thing away right now, just a few, a few moments there. So great. Well, thank you again. And now we'll go on to Roni.
A number of years ago, I went to see a performance of Gertrude Stein's lecture, Plays, by the actor David Greenspan. I had tried reading Stein at various times in the years before and never really made much headway. But from the moment David opened his mouth, the language and its repetition made sense to me. His small gestures served as a kind of punctuation, missing from the written text, which oriented me, kind of making phrases both visual and oral. I was interested last week to hear Molly Haig speak about her background as a dancer and how it influenced her interaction with Gertrude Stein text. Later, I heard a recording of Stein speaking Idem the Same, a Valentine for Sherwood Anderson, which is an excerpt of that text is what my piece is using. And I was struck by the rhythm of her speech, the tonal quality, the energy of the delivery. And I would like to play you just a little bit of that so that you can hear her.
A Valentine to Sherwood Anderson, Idem the Same. I knew too that through them, I knew too that he was through. I knew too that he threw them. I knew too that they were through. I knew too, I knew too, I knew them. I knew to them. If they tear a hunter through.
Did you hear?
Yes, we did. Thank you. Wow.
Okay, good. So I felt that I knew her then. When I heard her voice reading this, I felt that her language was no longer kind of a mystery to me or that I couldn't enter it. So I began to wonder if it would be possible to translate the things that we experience through hearing into something that we could experience visually. So I was using wood, metal type, polymer plates, and linoleum blocks, and I set about constructing something that would engage the eye with language, but not in a totally linear way, somewhat like a collage. And using color as a conveyor of energy or sound. And some of the results were unplanned, happy accidents that I felt contributed to the movement of the piece. The cadence of the language translated through rhythmic spacing, repetition and modulation of the typefaces, sans serif and serif, uppercase and lowercase. How are we oriented to the text visually? How do we find our place? Are there parts that function like a refrain of a song? Do we return to them again and again, adding information between each time the refrain repeats? Very fine is my Valentine, very fine, and very mine. Very mine is my Valentine, very mine and very fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And since this piece is double-sided, you sent it to us in a two-sided frame, presented an interesting challenge to figure out how we wanted to hang it. I think initially when we were talking through email, I said I would kind of hang it straight sticking out from the wall so people could see it that way, but that didn't quite work with the way that the show was starting to come together.
Perfect.
And and so we got this arch, and actually I'm sitting right underneath it. There's the arch right in the middle of the gallery, and it hangs right there. And people have to, wait to see the other side until they get around the other side of this wall, because we have a pedestal here as well with other books underneath it. So it creates an interesting new wall here in the gallery. So yeah. So thank you. Okay. And next we've got James.
Can I ask Roni a question? This is sort of a burning question.
Yeah.
Do you know who the director of the David Greenspan piece with Gertrude Stein was?
I will look it up and email you.
No, because I have a suspicion of who it could have been. Could it have been David Herskowitz?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean,
anyway.
I looked it up recently, because it was like in 2009. I don't think it was David, but I will look it up and I will tell you.
Anyway, I've been close to him for a very long time, actually.
Okay.
And his wife is like my mentor, essentially.
Oh, really? Okay.
But anyway.
Well, if you ever get a chance to see David, though, I mean, he is like magic.
Oh, yeah, I have. I've seen him many times.
Okay.
It's fantastic. So I guess I have to talk about this.
Yes. So I do have both. I've got two slides for this piece. So
yes, but it's good that you have two slides, because it exists in two states, right? The thing that I was trying to do was make a piece that had essentially two lives, and I started calling them duplicities, actually, because of this thing. I wanted to kind of say, it started as something completely different, where I was putting glow-in-the-dark vinyl onto canvas and trying to get it to be completely sort of blank looking, and then try to get it to to be something that could, like you'd turn the lights off and then suddenly you would see the message, and then you turn the lights back on and it would disappear again. But then I had some frustrating experiences trying to figure out how to do that, and then I realized that I could print vinyl on both sides of a canvas, and it would do essentially like it's a scrim, like one of these store-bought canvases that have these very pristine and even coats of gesso, could easily be sort of I could figure out how to put a light through it in the back. Don't do that yet.
Tell me reaching.
So the idea is you walk into the gallery or wherever this is showing, and you can kind of read that it says, and this is the full title of the piece is, everything is fine, everything is fine, everything is normal, everything is normal. And then there's a light behind the canvas that's on a timer. So I think it's 4 minutes, the light comes on, and it shows you that what this is actually something I call an embedded acrostic. So you can move to the next. And this is what it says on the other, when the light comes on every 4 minutes. For like a minute, the light comes on and you see this message. I was trying to express somehow the spirit of the day, which I feel is like very sort of, duplicitous, essentially. People saying one thing and behaving in completely different ways. And it's sort of a disturbing trope of our national character, that people, love these surfaces and then completely behave as if, you know, the surface is really all there is. And I was appalled by a number of really unpleasant news items. And this, I mean, you can see that there's a sort of, that it refers to a didactic, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's more didactic than it is a didactic, if you know what I mean by that. But I'm not sure there's all that much more I want or need to say about it.
Yeah.
I'm still in the middle of doing a series of these. They're actually kind of new. And so I haven't really explored it to the degree that I would like to. But this was one of the early ideas.
Yeah, and well, also I should mention that this was the piece that received the Best in Show award. So it's congratulations on that. And also, you know, when people come in and they're seeing, you know, the piece in this state, it's kind of an unassuming thing. I mean, they're trying to figure out what it says, but then more often than not, I've noticed when people are, you know, approaching the wall that this is on, they have like, you know, I don't know, a minute or less, and then all of a sudden it changes, and like it's really interesting to be able to witness that. And some people are, you know, first of all shocked that it's changed before their eyes. They didn't know that was going to happen. And then, you know, when they read what's there, and then they think about, you know, what it said before and what it says, you know, in its second state. I mean, it kind of, you know, there's like this exhale and like, you know, what, like, wow, this is, yeah. So I think that your intention with the piece definitely comes through. So congratulations.
And there should be this really awful feeling that comes when the light goes off, right?
Yeah. I mean,
after you understand all this, everything is fine again.
Yeah, and I mean also the fact that you know, those letters that are on the top are gold. I mean, that kind of is another layer of, you know, everything is fine, and it's like it's super shiny and gold and pretty and valuable, and you know, it's like we can avert our attention. So yeah, definitely, you know, it's something that's it's so simple that it's so complex too. I mean, it's an interesting piece. And
yeah, I mean, it involves having to write two things at the same time, which is not something I was used to doing before. Because, you know, if you're thinking about how to place each of these letters, you have to kind of, and you're trying to write the text that's behind it, you have to do both things at once. And you like look for words that have the right letter in the, that have the letter that you're coming up to. It's a pain. I mean, but you know, a pain that I enjoy.
Yeah, and actually, people have more than one person. So we'll say at least two people have had the question of, you know, what, like, if I knew what the process was like, you know, like which slide here did you, or which side of it did you write first?
I wrote them both at the same time.
Okay. Yeah.
I had to. I mean, there wasn't another way to do it.
Yeah.
And the more difficult thing is actually, I mean, there's all this technical stuff with like pulling the weed. You have to weed lettering off a sheet of vinyl, and so there was a whole issue with like pulling it off the sheet, and then the one on the back has to be the one on the back has to be backwards, and it has to fit exactly on the other side, and you have to do it with an iron press. It's a weird process, and it's hard to explain. But hopefully it looks really seamless. That's like that. I actually wanted it to look even more manufactured than it does. I was gonna like dip it in lucite or something and make it just like the surface really completely like neutral. But that didn't really work. And I also thought about other materials, but it turns out that like canvas is one of the only things that I can think of that actually does exactly what I needed it to do. Which is, it's opaque, completely opaque before light shines through. And then when you turn the light on, it's like, boom,
Yeah. Sometimes you just you don't need to dig any deeper with the material. You just you go with what works. So, and then we've also got another piece in the show. So I will go to that slide as well. And this one, we're seeing light on the surface here because this is another one that's a little tricky, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I was talking about earlier. It's a 16 by 20 didactic, where there is, there's technically a work of art that it's supposed to refer to, but the work of art is really a rhetoric. I say that, but that's not actually even true, because a lot of these pieces are inspired by the materials, right? Like I found some black gesso, and I was like, well, what could I do with black gesso in the sort of gestalt that I'm forming? And this is one of the things I thought would be fun. Like, oh, I'll print black letters on black gesso and just see what that looks like. And then this composition, I'm using the word because I'm looking at the piece, but like this paragraph came out of the process of thinking about the materials and what that was going to look like and mean. I didn't think it actually would be as readable as it is. And I think because when you shine a light on it, it actually seems a lot more readable, but you do have to kind of stand there, right? Was that your experience? I mean, you're there with it, right? So you know this.
Yeah, I mean, the image, I think, allows, the image of the piece that we see now allows, for you to read it well. I think you could read it well without having that light shined on it, but, you don't, on a static image, you don't have the experience of walking up to something and kind of going from side to side to be able to read it, based on the way the light comes off of it. And also this has nothing to do with the piece or the way I think about the piece, but the image itself reminds me of a few years ago when they had the whole thing about the dress, whether it was white or blue. Oh. So I'm looking at the text and I know the text is black, but then I'm looking at it and then it's like, is it white? Is it like orange? And I think that's more a statement on technology and image legibility than anything else, but it's a total aside. So.
Yeah, and the font is stolen from MoMA.
Well, I think then that means I should probably go there one day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
I mean, when things can be gone to.
Well, that's true. So, well, great. Well, thank you so much. And I think this is a good lead in to talking about Holland's work as well. So, so Holland will take it away. Thank you again, James.
Thanks. It's so great to see all the work. And James, your last piece reminded me, part of my process of putting this piece together was to go to galleries and museums and take notes about what all of those descriptive texts said, specifically about the media of the pieces. So let me describe how this piece works first, and then I could talk a little bit about its background. What we see is a still shot, but the work is being created by querying a database. And so every few seconds, depending on the length of the text, the display changes and you see a whole other set of words that describe a fictional work of art. And so I have no idea what the description is going to be and whether it makes any sense or not. It just self-assembles. And so hopefully the viewer goes and imagines some work of art that is described briefly but doesn't actually exist there in the space. Maybe someone will even make one of these works of art sometime. That would be really fun. And if you want to see an online version of the piece and watch it change and generate new texts and new descriptions, that's available. And I think the link will be posted along.
Yeah, we'll put that in the comments here.
Yeah, that would be great. So the specific items that come together to make each one of these descriptions are a description of of the medium of the artwork, which is, typical for what you would see in a gallery. In this case, it's a halftone print. And then there's some phrase that talks about what is being depicted in that work of art. So in this case, it's depicting railroad construction and maintenance. And then the subject matter of the work of art is taken from the Library of Congress subject index. And so we see that the Library of Congress subject is epic poetry, Croatian history, and criticism. And so the next moment when the piece refreshes, you'll see a different kind of medium, a different depiction, like an interactive installation. This one actually doesn't depict anything. It skipped that, which is fine. But it is about trucking law and legislation in Europe. So it's a little cheeky. It's a little, it can be a little silly. Humor is totally fine with this work. And I have a real fetish with note cards, I guess. They're a real important part of my creative practice. I'm constantly writing on them. And the display for this is approximately 4x6, like a 4x6 note card. And so when you watch it refresh, you get a sense that you're looking at a stack of note cards that never ends. It's a kind of unbound book that lasts forever. And
I've got a few more screenshots as well, so I'll keep going through them.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's see some others.
Yeah.
Yeah, making visible gasoline taxes. That sounds like an important thing that we'd want to see a work of art about, especially as they relate to case studies of Chinese medicines. So I'm constantly surprised by by what the work produces, and the part of the interest, my interest in making this is sort of an interest in completeness, an interest in infinity and categorizations, how we divide up the world, how we say this is part of this knowledge and this is part of something else. When I was young, I worked in my local library that sorted books by the Dewey Decimal System, and I was really intrigued that there were things like computers and computer languages, which I was really interested in at the time, that of course didn't exist when Dewey came up with that system. And so they have to like carve up this little tiny slice of numbers in order to slot this big shelf of books in. And the rupture in those kinds of intellectual systems became interesting to me, and is something that I fool around with in the work. I'm not sure what else to say about, the piece is supposed to be pretty quotidian, It's like the text is a very standard text. It's a note card. It's printed on a note card. It's displayed on off-the-shelf components. So this is a little microcomputer, a Raspberry Pi, and a little LCD screen. So I feel like my work as an artist isn't necessarily about the surface of those things, the physicality of those things. I'm using often off-the-shelf parts and just assembling them. And my work is more in the background with the code, choosing the data, and figuring out how it all gets put together. Wow, horns 8. These are brass octets in this one. Cool. Had never seen that before. There are just thousands and thousands of different subjects that the Library of Congress has identified. And so, it's constantly a surprise.
How many different slides are in this piece?
Well, I guess there's a mathematical way of knowing, but I haven't calculated it yet. So there are many fewer art media and depictions compared to choices of subject matter. And so you could do the math and figure it out, but it would be, easily run into the millions of unique combinations.
So it's safe to say that it's never been the same since it's been here.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another part of it, which when I teach a lot of classes about creativity and about making to students who are not art majors. So they're not dancing or making music or visual artists. They're not writers. They don't think of themselves that way, but they're interested in creativity. And so, of course, I make sure that they have to make things as part of this class because you can't talk about creativity without actually making something. And so students often will say, well, I don't know what to make. What should the work be about? Which is kind of a funny thing when you ask that to another artist. Like most of us don't sit down and think, oh, right, this is now about global warming and, I've got blue paint and done, right? Like dusted, we're all set. But students don't always get that separation between the subject matter and the content, and they're not sure about what to make. And so now I have this little gadget, and I can be like, let's check the magic 8-ball and see what work you should make, and then plug it in, and I can say, well, clearly you should make yourself a watercolor about sailing that depicts sailing with information about geriatric nursing. And they're like, thanks, but no thanks, So there's a little bit of a funny teaching aspect of it that I've used before, but that's just a side part of why I made the work.
And it's interesting too to see. I mean, with a lot of this work in the show, interaction is a big part of the piece. Not only standing and viewing, but interacting. And I mean, the pages are kind of turning for you in this piece, but it's interesting when you see, there's a screen and there's text on it, and it describes something. People have asked, like, how do I see what's being described here? So that's been that's been really interesting. So we get to talk a lot about using your imagination, which is exciting, just I think that it definitely creates a lot of imagery for people as they're reading these things. So.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection to the conceptualists that James mentioned earlier, with their sort of plain use of text that then is evocative of something else. So I'm really glad to hear that people are having an excuse to use their imagination. That's an important thing. It's a muscle we've all got to exercise.
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to remind people that they can type questions in. I know somebody, Ruben, had wondered if you could ask questions earlier. Definitely can. So please feel free to type those in, because we're getting close to wrapping up here. But definitely, this has been another exciting artist talk tonight. So anyone have questions for each other on the panel? Stop the share here. Put us all back. All right. Well, I think.
Wait.
Yeah.
I have a question for Michael. So, Michael, can you unmute yourself? I'm curious if you're thinking about the life of your book. Like, let's say a library wanted to acquire it. I mean, would you think that you would? I mean, would there be two copies, an intact copy and a not intact copy, or would it be up to them if they wanted to destroy it and that's what they keep, or what are you thinking?
I would have to say that was probably in the back of my head as I was making it, and I think that's where the box comes from, because we have a pretty great research center at school, and I've spent quite a bit of time going through the book arts archives up there this year. So I think the box definitely was intended so that you can take this mess and kind of store it for later. But I mean, I think I wouldn't really. I think it's up to the collection how they would decide, because I mean the book's really about people making their own choices, I guess. I mean, if it was up to me, I would probably prefer it be read and and then someone can see the mess afterwards, because I think it'd be more interesting. Because if it was unread, then anyone who goes to see it would probably not really get very much out of it. It's kind of sealed. So
unless you include somehow the film.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
It also seems like it could be a performance
Yeah, that's been brought up.
by either you or whoever happens to want to tear it apart.
Mhm.
Yeah, which is probably why your your critique got derailed and talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, critiques often are that way, but
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, great. Great. Any other questions, comments, or observations, funny jokes, or anything like that? Okay. All right. Well, great. Well, thank you all. This has been another great talk. And if you, as I said in the beginning of the talk, if you want to come and see the exhibition in person, you can do so by booking an appointment at mainstreetartscs.org. If you would like to see it in its interactive format where you can see each of the pieces and also see the way it's installed in the gallery, you can go to interactive.mainstreetartscs.org. And that's also, those links also appear in the comments here. The exhibition is up through August 7th. And like I said before as well, if you want to come for a visit, we are open Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. and you'll have 45 minutes for your appointment to see the show, which is, you got to really, look at there's a lot to look at in 45 minutes. So it's been interesting to see people, kind of reach the end of that time before they even get through the whole thing. So so again, thank you so much, and we'll talk to a whole new set of people next week, and we hope that all of you out there will join us again next Friday at 5 p.m. with 4 additional artists. So take care and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank
Nice
you.
to see you all.
Yeah, great to see your work. Thanks.
Bye.